My name is Teresa Holloway. I'm 68 years old, retired nurse, widow. I live in the same house where I raised my son and buried my husband. People say I'm gentle, but I know better. I'm quiet, which they mistake for softness. I'm observant, which they confuse for frailty. But I've learned something over time. When you're no longer seen, you begin to see everything. It was a warm Sunday afternoon when I walked into my son's backyard, carrying a peach cobbler I had baked that morning. I had dusted the crust with cinnamon, just the way he liked it when he was a boy. I wore a light sweater, my blue one, the one Frank used to say made me look like spring. I hadn't worn it in years. I thought, maybe today. The gate creaked as I pushed it open. Laughter spilled through the slats of the wooden fence. I took one step in, then I heard it. Wait, she's still alive? The voice was unmistakable. Emily, my daughter-in-law. Light, dry, meant to be tossed away, like a used napkin. Someone else chuckled. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to split something quiet and old inside me. A laugh like a door slamming where I'd once been welcome. I didn't drop the cobbler. I didn't even pause. I stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, like someone who hadn't just been made a ghost. That's when it hit me. I wasn't supposed to be there. I wasn't expected. Worse, I wasn't wanted. But I didn't leave. I walked through their backyard like a woman who had been invited. Past the picnic table with mason jar centerpieces, past the string lights overhead, past Emily's mother giggling too loud at something someone's husband had said. No one turned to greet me. Not my son. Not my grandchildren. Not even the dog wagged its tail. I stood there holding the dish like a tray of apologies until Emily noticed me. Her voice sharpened into a smile. Oh, Teresa, we didn't know you were coming. Her tone was the same one she used with waitresses who brought the wrong drink. I brought cobbler, I said. My voice didn't crack. Oh, that's nice. She didn't take it from me. She just gestured vaguely toward the food table and turned back to her conversation before I had a chance to put the dish down. I found a spot at the far end of the long table, next to a cooler and a stack of unopened napkins. The folding chair creaked under me. I straightened my back. Children ran by me, my grandchildren. One bumped my arm without looking. None of them said, "Hi, Grandma." No one offered me a plate. I sat there with my hands folded on my lap, my palms still warm from the ceramic dish. I watched the way the sunlight bounced off everyone else's glasses, how their conversations wove together like threads I wasn't allowed to touch. At one point, Thomas stood to give a toast. He raised his beer can high. To family. Everyone cheered. No one looked at me. I remembered when he was 12 and had cried into my shirt because he thought no one liked him. I had held him until his shoulders stopped shaking. I had whispered, "You'll always have a place with me." Now I was at a table where no one saved me a seat. I watched Emily float around the yard like a host on a talk show, smiling wide, touching arms, refilling drinks. She didn't glance my way again, but I didn't need her to. I had heard everything I needed before the party even began. She's still alive? The words echoed under the music, under the clinking forks, under every polite omission of my name. They clung to the inside of my chest like dust in an unused drawer. Still alive. I wondered when I had become someone people were surprised to see breathing. Was it when I stopped driving at night? When I forgot birthdays? When I started repeating myself during stories? I watched as Thomas leaned over to kiss Emily's cheek. She laughed, eyes shining. My son, my only child. The boy I once pulled from a creek after he slipped on a mossy rock and thought he was drowning. He hadn't looked at me once. I sat there for 2 more hours. Then, without a word, I stood up. I picked up the untouched cobbler, still warm under the foil. I walked past the laughing clusters, past the grill, past the string lights. No one stopped me. No one called after me. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just forgetfulness. This wasn't a busy day. This was erasure. Intentional. Quiet. Clean. But I wasn't gone. Not yet. I sat at the edge of the folding table, the kind with uneven legs that tilt slightly every time someone shifts their weight. It wobbled as a little girl. I think she was one of Emily's nieces, leaned across it to grab another juice pouch. She didn't look at me, just took what she wanted and ran off, barefoot, squealing. The cobbler I had placed gently on the side table sat untouched. Not a spoonful missing. Not even a fly circling, like it somehow knew what everyone else did. This dish had no place here. No one offered me a drink. I hadn't expected a cocktail, but maybe a glass of water, or a smile, something. A younger woman, I didn't know her name, walked by carrying a bowl of guacamole. She paused for a moment, looked at me like I was someone's old aunt who'd wandered into the wrong yard, and said, "Hi there," before disappearing toward the crowd laughing near the fire pit. Her tone was cheerful, but empty. No recognition, no warmth, just noise. Thomas was playing lawn games with the kids. I watched as Ruby, my granddaughter, ran after a beanbag, her hair flying behind her. I remembered the way she used to run straight to me whenever she saw me, all knees and elbows and sticky fingers. I used to carry strawberry candies in my purse just for her. Today, she ran past me twice. Once so close that the breeze lifted the edge of my skirt. She didn't say hello, didn't even glance. A younger version of me would have made excuses for them, would have said, "They're distracted. It's a busy day. They'll come around." But I'm not younger anymore, and I've run out of excuses. I watched Thomas as he tossed the beanbag, laughing, joking with Emily's brother. He hadn't seen me yet, or at least hadn't let himself look. He was wearing the navy shirt I bought him last Christmas. He had told me he loved the fit, said it was perfect. I never saw him wear it again. Until today. I wondered if he even remembered who gave it to him, or if, like the cobbler, the shirt just showed up and he took it for granted. Music played from a Bluetooth speaker set near the back patio. Something loud, something fast. Not for people over 40, certainly not for someone nearly 70. The bass made the plastic chairs vibrate slightly. A group of teens stood around taking selfies, angling their faces toward the sun, pouting and posing, unbothered. One of them held up her phone, snapped a shot, then lowered it and said, "Ugh, delete." I look like her. I didn't ask who she meant. I didn't need to. I sat up straighter in my seat. My back ached, but I refused to slouch. Emily passed by again. She was holding a tray of drinks and didn't stop. I cleared my throat gently. Not enough to call attention, just enough to say, "I'm here." She looked over, smiled that tight, camera-ready smile of hers. "Did you want a plate?" she asked, her voice like a wind chime too close to a storm. I looked up at her. "I'm fine." She nodded too quickly, already turning away before I could say more. Her heels clicked against the patio stones. I stayed seated. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I didn't ask for anything. It wasn't pride. It was clarity. This wasn't my table anymore. Not in the way that mattered. Someone made a joke at the far end, and everyone laughed too loud. I didn't catch the punchline, but I felt the distance in the sound. Laughter, when it doesn't include you, feels like thunder through a closed window, loud, sharp, and impossibly far away. Thomas finally turned in my direction. Our eyes met for half a second. He smiled, lifted his drink. "Glad you made it, Mom," he said, like I had arrived late to a lecture. I nodded. No smile. "To family," he said, raising his can again, echoing the toast he gave earlier. This time it was just for me, but said too late. I lifted my hand, barely. He had already turned back. No one saw me raise it. So I let it fall. I stared at my hands in my lap, wrinkled, veined. These hands had buttoned his shirts, made his lunches, held his head when he cried over scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks. These hands had held our family together. Now they rested quietly, ignored like their owner. The sun had shifted, casting a long shadow across my legs. The warmth I had brought with me, both in my dish and in my heart, had no place here. It was as if the whole yard had conspired to teach me the one lesson I had resisted learning all my life. Sometimes, even when you show up, you're not invited. And sometimes, the absence isn't in the seat they don't offer. It's in the space they make sure you don't fill. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights. I slipped off my shoes, placed the cobbler dish in the sink without rinsing it, and walked through the quiet house. The silence wrapped around me like a coat I hadn't worn in years, familiar in weight, but strange in comfort. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. I always use the small one now. No need for a big pot anymore. The ticking of the stove's dial filled the kitchen while I waited for it to boil. I leaned against the counter and looked around. Same curtains, same chipped tile near the sink where Frank used to stand, peeling apples in the fall. He was meticulous with fruit, always made sure no bruise made it to the pie. He'd hum while he worked, a tune I never quite recognized, but always associated with warmth. I sat down at the small table by the window, the same table where Thomas used to do his homework, bent over worksheets with his pencil clenched tight in his hand. He'd ask me questions without looking up, trusting I'd have the answer. Back then, I did. Back then, I was needed. The kettle whistled softly, not shrill like the old one. I poured the water into a mug already waiting with a bag of chamomile and honey. Frank used to tease me for how I liked my tea. Like sunshine in a cup, he called it. The mug was one of Frank's old favorites, with faded blue lettering that read, "World's Okayest Dad." We found it at a flea market once. I almost didn't buy it, but he insisted. Said it was the most honest mug he'd ever seen. I ran my finger along the rim as I waited for it to cool. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and disappointment. Outside, the wind had picked up. The branches of the oak in the backyard knocked gently against the window pane. I used to find that sound comforting. Tonight, it just felt like knocking I wasn't ready to answer. I sipped the tea. It didn't taste like sunshine tonight. It tasted like habit. I looked around the room again, trying to locate something new, anything. But everything here was memory. The framed cross-stitch Frank's sister had made. The dented tin I kept flour in. The apron still hanging on the hook, though I hadn't worn it in months. The quiet wasn't peaceful. Not like people think. It was hollow. It didn't hum like before when laughter used to live here. It sat in the corners, collecting itself, feeding off the spaces where voices used to echo. There was a time when I'd dread coming home to an empty house. When Frank passed, I couldn't stand the creak of the floors. I'd turn on the TV just to fill the room. Talk shows, weather updates, anything. Now, I didn't even flinch at the stillness. I welcomed it. Not because I liked it, but because I'd finally stopped pretending I could change it. I brought the mug to the living room and sat in my chair, the one facing the window. I didn't turn on a lamp. The moonlight was enough. Frank's photo sat on the shelf across from me. He was smiling in it, holding a fishing rod, squinting like he always did when the sun hit his eyes just right. I smiled back, weakly. "If you saw today," I whispered, "you'd say I should have walked out." I imagined his voice, gentle, teasing. I would have said, "Finish your tea first, then decide." So I drank slowly, as if doing so bought me time. I didn't cry. I didn't speak again. I just sat in the half-light, the mug warming my hands, and let the quiet answer every question I hadn't asked out loud. I thought about the backyard, the laughter, the sting of being forgotten so publicly, so cleanly, still alive. The phrase rang like a church bell in my chest. They weren't surprised I had come. They were surprised I hadn't gone yet, that I still took up space, that I still existed outside the lines they had drawn. I finished the tea, set the mug down carefully, and then, for the first time in a long time, I let the silence settle, not as a punishment, but as a choice. The world had stopped asking me for anything, so maybe it was time I started asking something of it in return. I couldn't sleep that night. The tea was supposed to help. It usually did, but instead of soothing me, it had stirred something up, like warm water loosening old paint from a wall. I lay in bed with the covers up to my chin, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly, clicking faintly with each revolution. A rhythm with no meaning, just noise. At around 2 a.m, I got up. The hallway light flickered for a second before settling. I shuffled into the study, the small room I once called Frank's den, now more like a storage space for everything I hadn't figured out how to throw away. Old shoeboxes, holiday decor, half-filled notebooks, and a filing cabinet with a sticky drawer I hadn't opened in over a year. I don't know what made me pull it out. Maybe I needed proof that I hadn't imagined all the years I gave them. Maybe I just wanted to remind myself that I had, at some point, mattered. The bottom drawer gave way with a grunt. I sat on the floor in my robe and slippers, papers spreading around me like leaves, receipts, tax records, letters from the mortgage lender, donation thank yous, the kind of paperwork that tells the story of a life, line by line, in dull ink. And then I found it. A folder labeled in my handwriting, Thomas, House Support. I pulled it out slowly. The paper inside was soft at the edges, touched too many times over the years. Inside, there were copies of wire transfers, dated back 5 years ago. The big one, $98,000, was highlighted. The memo read, "Home down payment, gift to Thomas and Emily." Next to it, I had written a note to myself. Promised to repay 50% when possible. Said I didn't need it back but want to keep record. I remembered that phone call like it happened yesterday. Thomas had called me in a panic. The market was moving fast. He and Emily had found the perfect place, but the seller was demanding a quick close. They needed help. I hadn't hesitated. I had taken it from the account Frank left for me. I told Thomas it was a gift, but I also told him I trusted him to do what's right in the future. He said, Of course, Mom. You'll always be taken care of. Another lie, hidden in a pretty promise. I turned to the back of the folder and found the email printout, one I had kept just in case. It was from their lawyer, a scanned copy of the title, Emily's name, and Thomas's, but not mine. Nowhere. Not even a lien holder, not even a mention as lender or witness. Nothing. I stared at the paper. My name, once used so easily for PTA rosters and emergency contact forms, wasn't even an afterthought. They had taken the money and wiped me from the record like a smudge on a window. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe the lawyer hadn't known to include me. Maybe Thomas thought it didn't matter because I said I didn't need anything in return. But then I remembered that backyard, that sentence. She's still alive? And suddenly I knew. They hadn't just taken the money. They had taken the story of it, too. Made it theirs. Told themselves a version where they built that house on their own. Where they were independent. Where I had never needed to be remembered because I'd served my purpose. They weren't just trying to forget me now. They had started years ago. I felt something tighten behind my ribs. Not anger exactly. Not even pain. Just an ache that settled in, old and familiar. I gathered the papers and placed them back into the folder, carefully, like tucking a child in bed. Then I stood, walked to the mirror hanging by the coat closet, looked at myself. The woman staring back had silver hair curling softly at her shoulders. Wrinkles around her eyes, yes, but also something steady in her jawline. Something clear. I had given everything, and they had taken it with soft hands and false gratitude. But I was not foolish, and I was not finished. I had always kept my promises. It was time to see whether they would keep theirs. The next morning, I called Grace. I hadn't spoken to her in over a year, not because we were on bad terms, but because life simply got in the way. Grace was the kind of friend who didn't need constant maintenance. We had met in our late 40s at a volunteer legal clinic, back when I was helping with event coordination, and she was already a practicing estate lawyer with a sharp wit and a generous heart. She picked up on the third ring. Teresa? Her voice sounded like surprise mixed with genuine warmth. Well, now there's a voice I miss hearing. Are you okay? I'm not sure, I said, but I think I need your help. Say the word. I hesitated. I didn't know how to ask the kind of question that made you sound like a fool for waiting this long. Do you remember when Thomas bought that house? The one out in Ashwood Hills? Grace paused. Yes, the one you helped finance, right? I gave them the down payment. Almost $100,000. I never asked to be paid back, but I assumed my name would be on something. And it's not? No, I said. Not even a line. I just found the title deed. Only Thomas and Emily. There was silence on the other end. Then the sound of rustling papers. She was already looking for something to jot on. Did you sign anything waiving your rights? Or any kind of gift letter? Nothing formal. It was all trust. Grace exhaled slowly. Okay, that limits things, but not completely. I could hear her thinking. That was the thing about Grace. She always weighed the law against the moral ledger in her head. She believed in both justice and people, and she knew when the two didn't align. Let me ask you this, she said carefully. Why now? What made you look? I looked down at the mug of coffee in my hand. I hadn't touched it. The cream was curdling on top. Yesterday, at Thomas's barbecue, I said. I overheard someone ask if I was still alive. They weren't joking. Oh, Teresa. And no one came to greet me. Not one toast. Not even a hello from Ruby. Grace didn't speak. She didn't need to. I need to know, I continued, what I can do. If I don't have legal recourse, I at least want clarity. And if I do, I need to think about what fairness looks like now. I understand, she said. Her tone was all business now, but not cold, just steady. Okay, first things first. I want you to gather every document you have. The wire transfers, any emails, texts, voicemails, even handwritten notes, anything that proves intent. I have it, I said. All of it. Good, that helps. Even without a formal agreement, courts sometimes recognize something called a resulting trust or unjust enrichment, especially if you can show your contribution directly benefited the purchase. And what about revoking anything? Power of attorney? Medical directives? Grace's voice sharpened. Wait, do they still have POA over you? I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I gave Thomas durable power of attorney 5 years ago. Frank was still alive then. We thought it made sense. Right, because he was your only child. Yes. Well, then that needs to change. Today. I blinked. Can I revoke it just like that? If you're competent, and I know you are, you can revoke it any time. Same goes for medical decisions, financial oversight, everything. Something loosened. In my chest. I hadn't even realized that part. Thomas having control was weighing on me too. But it was. Grace's voice softened. Teresa, this doesn't make you vindictive. This makes you cautious. And finally, clear-eyed. I'm not trying to punish them. I know. I trailed off. I don't want to be erased. Grace was quiet again. Then she said, You won't be. But it's time to make sure you write your name back into your own story. That line sat with me. It still does. By the end of the call, we had a plan. I'd meet her Thursday. She'd help draft the revocation letters and look into whether we could establish grounds for legal reconsideration of my financial gift. When I hung up, the room was still silent. But this time, it didn't feel like the silence of being ignored. It felt like the quiet before something shifted. Not a storm. A decision. Grace greeted me at the door of her small law office with a hug that lingered just long enough to remind me I wasn't alone. The building was tucked behind a florist and a shuttered tailor's shop, the kind of place you'd miss unless you were looking for it. It didn't need to be flashy. Grace wasn't in the business of show. She was in the business of clarity. We walked into her office. Sunlight spilled across the desk, illuminating the stacks of documents she had already laid out. She offered me tea, but I shook my head. My hands were already full of years. Years of being too polite, too quiet, too trusting. Let's begin, she said gently, motioning for me to sit. Her tone was the same one she used back when we organized that estate planning seminar at the community center. Firm, but never forceful. I sat down across from her. A legal pad rested in front of me with the words, Revocation of Power of Attorney, Teresa Holloway. She tapped it once. This is your right. Not a threat. Not revenge. Just a reset. I exhaled. It feels heavy. It feels overdue, she replied. We walked through the paperwork slowly. She explained each step, each clause. It wasn't dramatic. There were no courtroom speeches or pounding gavels, just ink and intent. By signing this, she said, pointing to the final page, you remove Thomas's legal authority to act on your behalf. Financially, medically, legally, everything. I hesitated. Do I need to explain to him? Grace shook her head. Legally, no. Ethically, that's up to you. But you don't owe anyone an explanation for reclaiming your autonomy. I looked down at the paper. My signature line waited, blank and expectant. Then I thought of Thomas's voice on the phone 5 years ago. Of course, Mom. You'll always be taken care of. And I thought of his voice at the party, not saying a single word to me. And I thought of his wife, the look in her eyes, when she saw me like I was an unexpected leak in the roof. Something she hoped someone else would fix quietly. I signed. The pen didn't shake. Grace took the papers and slid them into a folder, sealing it with a clasp that clicked into place like punctuation. Now, she said, we also need to talk about your will. I revised it 2 years ago. Let's revise it again. Remove anything that assumes Thomas will act in your best interest. Remove anything that names him as executor or beneficiary, unless you want him there. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked out the window. A young woman walked by, pushing a stroller. She looked tired, hopeful, maybe 30. I wondered if she knew how fragile it all was, how easily love, if unguarded, can become convenience. I want my story, I said softly, to end the way I lived it, on purpose. Grace nodded. Then let's make sure your paper trail reflects that. By the end of the meeting, the revocation papers were filed. A notary had stamped her seal. My updated legal intentions were official. I was no longer under Thomas's legal shadow. It felt strange, not liberating in the cinematic way you'd expect, not triumphant, just steady, like standing on ground I hadn't realized had been tilted for years. As we packed up, Grace reached into her desk and pulled out a small blue envelope. "This is just for you," she said. I opened it. Inside was a business card. On the back, she had written in her handwriting, "Being your mother was a role. Being yourself is a right." I smiled, but it came with a sting behind my eyes. Grace walked me to the door. Before I stepped out, she touched my arm. "Teresa, you didn't just come here to break a bond. You came here to remember who you were before it got twisted." I didn't respond. I just nodded. As I stepped out into the early afternoon light, the air felt lighter, not because the wind had changed, but because I had. I wasn't leaving a lawyer's office. I was walking out of a holding pattern. And for the first time in years, no one else was holding the pen to my life but me. When I got home, the house was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful, but the kind that waits. Like even the walls were holding their breath. I hung my coat, took off my shoes by the rug Frank used to hate, and walked into the kitchen. The clock ticked above the fridge, a steady reminder that time kept moving, even when hearts paused. I didn't make tea. I didn't sit down. Instead, I walked straight to the drawer where I kept the notepad with all my passwords, the one I thought I'd never need to change. I opened my laptop and sat at the kitchen table. I started with the bank account, the joint savings that had my name and Thomas's, for emergencies, I once said. We opened it together 10 years ago, back when he still called me Mama sometimes and kissed my cheek without thinking. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I clicked, "Remove secondary account holder." It asked, "Are you sure?" I whispered, "Yes," and pressed confirm. Next was the online access to the utilities. He still had login rights. He once helped me set up auto payments and promised, "I'll handle it if anything happens, Mom." But nothing happened, except silence and forgotten birthdays. Click, remove access. Then came the medical portal. He was listed as the emergency contact and healthcare proxy. Not anymore. One by one, I revoked every permission I had given him over the years. They hadn't just been practical choices. They were acts of trust, symbols of closeness, invitations to still belong. But those permissions had become invisible chains. By the time I got to the insurance policy, I hesitated. He was still the beneficiary. Frank and I had listed him as the sole heir when we first bought the house. We didn't have much, but it was something. And it felt right then. It felt like a promise to the future. Now, it felt like handing a prize to someone who hadn't shown up to the race. I opened the settings. I changed it to a local women's scholarship fund. I'd once volunteered there. They helped women restart their lives after divorce, trauma, or just being forgotten. It felt appropriate. The final step was the Dropbox folder, the digital archive, old family photos, scans of documents, a few letters Frank had written to me in college that I never had the heart to delete. Thomas had full access. He could download, delete, share, anything. Until now. Click Remove User. And then I changed the master password. New passcode, October 1972. The year I married Frank. The year I began building a life that wasn't just about me. I leaned back in the chair. The laptop screen dimmed slightly, but I didn't move. I felt not relief exactly, more like stillness. A reset. A single tear ran down my cheek, not out of sadness, but as if my body needed to mark the moment, like ringing a small bell to say, something sacred has just shifted. I got up and walked to the kitchen window. The late afternoon sun was draping the fence in gold. The same backyard where I'd stood just days ago, invisible at my own son's celebration, where I'd heard a voice ask if I was still alive. Oh, I was alive. And now I was awake. As I closed the laptop and folded the notepad, I realized something. Thomas might never notice. He might never know the permissions were gone, the titles changed, the doors closed, because he hadn't truly looked at me in years. And that was okay. Because this wasn't about teaching him a lesson. It wasn't about bitterness. It was about boundaries. I was no longer standing at the gate, asking to be let in. I was walking through my own front door, alone, but whole. And this time I was locking it behind me, from the inside. It was nearly dark when I picked up the old address book, not the digital one, the one with real pages, leather-bound, frayed at the corners, and filled with names I no longer dialed. Some had passed. Others had simply drifted. It still smelled faintly of lavender oil. Frank used to tease me, said I scented everything like a Victorian widow. I smiled at the thought. It surprised me that I could still smile. I sat at the dining table and opened the book slowly. My fingers paused at the H section. Holloway, Thomas, and Emily Ashwood Hills. Cell 90355501114, Home 903-555-9973. I stared at the neat handwriting. Mine, from 8 years ago. Back then, writing his name had made me feel proud. It felt like planting something, like recording the roots of the family tree. Now, it looked foreign, cold. I reached for the pen I kept in the spine crease. Blue ink, the same kind I'd used to sign his birth certificate. Back then, the nurse had handed me the form and said, "You can name him anything." And I had whispered, "Thomas Elliot Holloway," like it was sacred. I held the pen over his name, then paused. There was a time I would have made excuses. He's just tired. It's Emily's influence. He doesn't realize how it feels. But excuses are just comfort food for the heart, empty, warm, and leaving you hungry later. I looked around the dining room. The chairs still sat in their usual places, one at each end, two on the side. Thomas used to sit there during Sunday dinners, tapping his fingers to signal he was ready for dessert. Now he was someone who'd ask his wife's family to raise a toast while I stood unseen 3 feet away. Someone who kept my name off property deeds. Someone who let silence answer my presence. And yet, he was still my son. I put the pen down and rested my head in my hands. What kind of mother deletes her own child? The voice inside me answered, not deletes, decides where the line ends. I took a breath, picked up the pen again, and drew a single, firm line through his name. Not with anger, not with spite, but with clarity. My hand trembled slightly, but my resolve did not. I didn't tear the page, didn't scribble him out in fury. I left the name there, just crossed, as a reminder that some doors don't need to be slammed, only shut. I flipped to the next page and stared blankly at names I hadn't read in years. Mrs. Kelly from church, Donna from the book club, Grace, her number starred and underlined now. I thought of calling someone, telling them what I'd done, but there was no announcement to make. This wasn't a war declaration. It was a private funeral for something already dead. The love remained. It always would. But love with no respect becomes something else. A leash, a silence you carry in your mouth so you don't lose the little they offer. I wasn't willing to carry that anymore. I closed the address book. As I stood up, the house didn't feel quite so cold. I lit the candle by the window. Frank's candle, the one we used to light on anniversaries. Tonight, it stood for something else. A line, drawn not in bitterness, but in peace. I sat in the armchair by the window and let the stillness surround me. Somewhere out there, Thomas was living a life I had helped build. A home I had partly paid for. Memories I had enabled. And yet, I was not welcome. That used to hurt like a burn. Now, it felt like a warning I had finally heard. I whispered aloud, perhaps to the house, perhaps to myself. I didn't stop being a mother. I just stopped waiting to be treated like one. And in that moment, something unhooked inside me. Not a dramatic release, not a sob, just a small internal click, like the closing of a clasp. Quiet, final, necessary. I looked down at the address book, now closed on the coffee table. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had updated more than just a page. I had updated my place in the story. It was late morning when I heard the knock. Soft, hurried, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping house. I opened the front door to see Lily standing on my porch, clutching a piece of paper with both hands. Her coat was slightly crooked, cheeks flushed pink from the cold, and her eyes lit up when she saw me. "Miss Teresa," she said breathless, "I made something for you." Before I could answer, she held the paper up proudly. It was a drawing, crayons on thick paper. At the center, there was a house with a yellow door, just like mine. And beside it, a woman with long gray hair and a purple sweater. 2 birds sat on her shoulders, and a sun with a smiling face hovered above them. In the corner, in wobbly letters, it read, "This is you. You're like sunshine." I stared at the drawing, not trusting my voice. Lily looked up at me. "Do you like it?" I crouched down, blinking fast. "Sweetheart, this is the most beautiful thing anyone's given me in a very long time." She beamed. "You always wave when I get off the school bus. And you made me cookies when I had that bad week. And mommy says you grow the best roses. You're my nicest grown-up. The words hit me harder than I expected, not because they were dramatic, but because they were simple, true, unfiltered by expectation. I invited her inside, made hot cocoa with extra marshmallows. She chatted about school, her pet hamster, and how she wanted to be a flower scientist when she grew up. I nodded, smiled, and listened, truly listened, for the first time in days without the weight of memory pressing down on me. She left an hour later, skipping down the path. I stood at the window, holding the drawing like a treasure map. That little girl saw me, not as a burden, not as a relic, not as someone to whisper about at family parties, just as me, Teresa, a neighbor, a friend, sunshine. I placed the drawing on the fridge, holding it with one of the ladybug magnets. It looked a bit crooked. I left it that way. It felt more real. Later that afternoon, I sat by the window again, sipping tea, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a woman erased from her own story. I felt visible. Isn't it strange how one small gesture can reset your compass? All those months I had wrapped my worth around Thomas's approval, around being invited, acknowledged, needed. But Lily didn't need legal paperwork to see my value. She didn't weigh inheritance or titles. She didn't care that I'd been removed from accounts or parties. She just saw the person who waved at the school bus every afternoon. That was enough. That was more than enough. I thought back to a phrase Frank used to say whenever I doubted myself. Sometimes the smallest windows let in the brightest light. I looked over at the crayon sun Lily had drawn. Maybe it was time I started looking through smaller windows. I took a notepad from the drawer and jotted something down. Just a thought, a truth I wanted to keep close. If I am no longer invited into their world, I will build one where I am seen. The wind rustled outside. A few birds landed near the feeder by the porch. And just like that, I felt the axis of my day shift. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. Not because a child gave me a drawing, but because, in her eyes, I hadn't disappeared. And that meant I didn't have to disappear to myself. Not anymore. That evening, as I folded laundry in the den, I found one of Ruby's socks tucked between two towels. Tiny, pale pink, with a stitched bunny near the ankle. It must have slipped into my laundry basket months ago, back when I was still going over to help. I held it gently, like it might crumble in my hand. And just like that, memory came rushing in, uninvited, unannounced, but unmistakably vivid. I was there the night Emily went into labor. Thomas had called me in a panic. "Mom, it's early. We weren't ready. Can you get over here? Please." Of course I went. Of course I did. I packed a small bag, grabbed my overnight kit, and drove in the rain to the hospital. I sat with Emily through the contractions while Thomas went to sign paperwork. She gripped my hand so tightly I thought my fingers would bruise. And when she finally gave birth to Ruby at 3:27 a.m., I was the first one to hold her while Emily rested and Thomas tried to process it all. Ruby opened her eyes for the first time in my arms, and I remember thinking, this is what it means to begin again. The next weeks were a blur of soft lullabies, burping cloths, and midnight bottles. Emily was exhausted. Thomas was unsure. I filled in the blanks, quietly, without making them feel incompetent. I cooked, I cleaned, I held Ruby while they napped, and I told them what my mother once told me. You'll mess up. But love covers a multitude of missed naps. I never asked for anything in return. It wasn't about that. It was about being present for my family in the ways that mattered most, ways that didn't come with invoices or legal agreements, just love. But then things started to change. At first, it was subtle. Emily forgot to text back. Thomas got busier. Invitations turned into afterthoughts. Sorry, we thought you had plans. We assumed you wouldn't want to come. It's mostly her side of the family. Ruby's nap schedule is all over the place. It's hard to coordinate visits. I understood. At least I tried to. I told myself it was just the season of life. New parents, full plates, shifting rhythms. But inside, something quieter began to take root. Doubt. Doubt that I was still welcome, still needed, still seen. And yet, I kept sending cards, dropping off fresh-baked bread, leaving little gifts for Ruby on their porch. Until one day, Emily texted me, short and clipped. Hey, Tanya, just a heads up. We're keeping the guest list super tight for Ruby's birthday. Just immediate family. Hope you understand. Immediate family. As if I'd somehow fallen outside of that circle. As if the woman who had bathed Ruby's newborn body and stayed awake through fevered nights was now just Tanya. I didn't respond to the message. I didn't trust myself to. Instead, I sat in the garden with the tiny party dress I'd bought weeks earlier, still wrapped in tissue paper. I had imagined Ruby wearing it as she smashed her first cake. Instead, it remained unopened, a symbol of how quickly love can be boxed and returned to sender. I looked down now at the little sock in my hand. How could something so small carry so much weight? I ran my fingers over the bunny's ears and remembered the way Ruby had giggled when I kissed her belly. The way her fingers had wrapped around mine when she was just weeks old. The way she had once rested on my chest and sighed like she belonged there. And then, she was gone. Not physically, but emotionally, quietly, drifted, like fog that burns off before you realize you were even surrounded by it. I placed the sock on the mantel, not out of sentimentality, but as a quiet vow to myself. A vow that I would remember the truth, that I had loved, that I had shown up, that I had mattered, even if no one else ever acknowledged it. Even if Ruby, one day, never remembers. I will. Because love doesn't always leave footprints in photographs or family albums. Sometimes it leaves a single sock, and sometimes that's all you need to keep walking forward. The message came in at 9:42 a.m., right as I was watering the rose bushes. I'd taken to tending them more lately. There was something reassuring about the rhythm. Cut, water, breathe. No questions asked, no explanations required. My phone buzzed in my apron pocket. I wiped my hands on the hem of my sweater and glanced at the screen. Thomas. Hey, just a heads up. We'll be out of town this weekend. Emily's cousin is having a baby shower, and it's a whole family thing. We'll catch up sometime next month, maybe. Hope you're well. That was it. No, how are you? No, we'd love to see you next week instead. Just a heads up, like I was a utility bill or a neighbor being notified of trash pickup delay. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the message. The roses dripped slowly behind me. I didn't reply. What was there to say? Instead, I turned the phone face down and went back to my shears. Clip by clip, I tried to focus on the thorns, the way the light hit the petals. But the numbness was already threading through my chest. He didn't even ask if I wanted to see Ruby. Not even a photo. Not even a sentence that sounded like he remembered I existed in her world. Just then, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was Emily. I hesitated. then answered. Her voice came sharp and quick, like stones skipping across a tense lake. Tanya, did you change the utility access? I tried logging in to pay the water bill, and it said I'm not authorized anymore. I stayed silent for a second too long. She filled it. And the Dropbox. And the health records. I don't know what's going on, but it's really inconvenient. Thomas is swamped at work, and now we're stuck dealing with all these changes. I cut in quietly. I've made some adjustments. She huffed. Without telling us? Tanya, that's not exactly considerate. I closed my eyes, pressing my thumb against the corner of the table. Emily, I said, I don't owe you that kind of access anymore. A pause, sharp, crackling. Her voice dropped an octave. Wow. Okay. I could almost see her expression through the phone. Disbelief, irritation. That cool tone she reserved for customer service calls and people who took too long in checkout lines. I just thought, she added, after everything, you'd at least have the courtesy to... After everything? I echoed softly. She didn't answer. I let the silence stretch. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was the kind of silence that says, I see what you won't say out loud. I've been listening longer than you've been speaking. Finally, I said, take care of Ruby. That's all I ask. I ended the call. No theatrics, no slammed phone. Just a quiet, final tap on the screen. I stood there staring at the sink. And for the first time in years, I realized my silence wasn't weakness. It wasn't surrender. It was choice. A boundary. A soft line drawn in firm ink. I didn't have to explain the shift in energy. I didn't have to justify removing them from my accounts, my passwords, or my emotional currency. Because when someone treats your presence like background noise, you are allowed to turn the volume all the way down. I dried my hands, placed the phone back into the drawer, and returned to the garden. There was a rose just starting to bloom, delicate, hesitant, but unmistakably alive, just like me, still blooming, still here, even if no one bothers to notice. I started writing the dates down in a notebook, just a plain, spiral-bound one I found, in the kitchen drawer beneath the spare batteries and faded coupons. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even for evidence. It was a ritual, a way to mark the silence. I wrote the first one at the top of the page, underlining it softly with my pen. March 14th, 9:02 a.m. Called Thomas. No answer. No callback. Beneath it, in smaller handwriting. Reason. Just wanted to check in. No emergency. Just missed my son. The second entry came 2 days later. March 16th. Texted Emily asking for Ruby's Easter dress size. No reply. By the time I reached the 6th entry, I stopped including reasons. The blank space said more than the words ever could. Sometimes I'd call during daylight, when I knew Ruby might be home. Sometimes I tried in the evening, when the house would be winding down and voices might soften. But there was no answer, not even the courtesy of a short, busy, talk later. The last voicemail I left was short. Hi, sweetheart. It's Mom. Just wanted to hear your voice. Hope you're all right. I listened to myself after I hung up. I sounded calm. Software A little too hopeful. I stopped leaving voicemails after that. Because at some point, unanswered messages don't just make you sad. They make you feel like you're trespassing, like even your attempts to reach out are somehow unwelcome noise in someone else's curated life. So I wrote them down instead. Each entry, like a pebble marking where the river stopped flowing. It wasn't meant to be morbid, just honest. Honest about the quiet. Honest about what was slipping away, not with slamming doors, but with unanswered rings. I started noticing the way silence took up space. At breakfast, the spoon against the bowl felt louder, the kettle's whistle more hollow. The birds outside chirped like they were filling a vacancy. And somehow, amidst it all, I felt myself shrinking. Not in worth, but in weight. Like my presence was becoming optional in their world. There was one evening in particular, late April. The sun had dipped low, painting long shadows on the wall. I had made lentil stew, the kind Thomas used to love as a boy. I'd even made cornbread from scratch. I set a second plate across from me, out of habit. Then I caught myself, stared at the empty chair, and whispered, "You're not coming, are you?" I left the extra plate there, let it sit cold, like a visual of what expectation becomes when left unattended, wasted warmth. Later that night, I opened the notebook again, April 27th, 5:21 p.m., called to invite them for dinner. No reply, no call back. And then I added a line. I'm no longer waiting. I underlined it twice. It wasn't a declaration made in anger. It was made in clarity. I wasn't punishing them. I was unfastening myself. There's a difference. Because waiting, when it's rooted in love, can be noble. But when it becomes a habit of self-erasure, of measuring your worth by someone else's urgency, you have to stop. I closed the notebook, ran my hand across its cover, and slid it into the drawer beside the tea bags and bills. It was enough to know the silence wasn't imagined. It was real, and I didn't need to chase it down anymore. The next morning, I woke up to birdsong and the slow warmth of sunrise across the quilt. I brewed my tea, took it out to the porch, and sat without reaching for my phone. I didn't check for messages. I didn't reread the old ones. I just sat. Alive. Here. Listening. Not for their voices, but for my own. And it was there, steady and whole, whispering what I already knew. You don't have to be heard by them to still matter. And I believed it, because sometimes the loudest freedom begins with the quietest decision. The doorbell rang at 10:06 on a Thursday morning. I wasn't expecting anyone. I had just taken banana bread out of the oven. The scent still lingered in the kitchen, warm and familiar. One of the few things lately that still felt like mine. I wiped my hands, opened the front door, and there she was. Emily. Hair pulled tight in a bun, jacket still zipped, lips thin and pale like she'd rehearsed this confrontation in the car mirror. "Can we talk?" she asked flatly, not waiting for me to say yes. She stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold air with her. I closed the door behind her, slowly. She walked into the living room like she'd never been a guest here, like the walls still belonged to her, like the photo on the mantle of me holding newborn Ruby wasn't now a relic of a version of us that no longer existed. I didn't offer her tea. She didn't sit. You've changed the utilities, the health proxy, the joint accounts. Her voice wasn't loud, but each word landed like a stone. You didn't tell us anything. You just cut us out. I held her gaze. No, Emily. I removed myself. She blinked, as if trying to recalibrate her argument. This affects Ruby, she said sharply. You're her grandmother. I nodded once. And I always will be. But that doesn't give you or Thomas the right to keep me in your lives only when it's convenient. Or when you need something signed, something paid for. Her arms crossed tight across her chest. This feels like revenge. No, I said quietly. This is clarity. There was a beat of silence. The clock above the fireplace ticked, once, twice. You think this is easy for me? She snapped. Thomas is hurt. He feels abandoned. That word, abandoned, hit me like a slap. But I didn't flinch. I stood straighter. I was at the hospital the day Ruby was born, I said. I stayed up those first nights so you two could sleep. I cooked. I cleaned. I sat with her when she had that terrible rash and wouldn't stop crying. I was there when no one else was. Emily looked away. And now, I continued, voice calm but unwavering, you exclude me from birthdays, holidays, family photos. You talk about me like I'm inconvenient, like I'm some obligation to manage. That's not fair, she started. No, I cut in, still calm. What's not fair is being erased and then being told I'm overreacting when I notice. She took a breath, trying to regain footing. We didn't mean to hurt you. I believe that, I said. But you did. And now I'm choosing something different, not to punish, just to protect myself. She looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing someone she hadn't expected to find, someone no longer bending, no longer asking, no longer silently swallowing the ache. There were no tears on my face, no shaking hands, just stillness, just truth. I'm still open, I said, to love, to Ruby, but not on terms where I'm only welcome when you need something. Emily's voice softened slightly. This wasn't how I wanted things to go. I tilted my head. But this is how they went. She looked down at the floor, then toward the mantel. Her eyes landed on the small crayon drawing Lily had given me, pinned beside a dried rose from my garden. Something shifted in her expression, something quieter. I didn't press. I didn't lecture. I let the silence speak. After a moment, she moved toward the door. I'll talk to Thomas. I gave her a small nod. That's up to you. Her hand hesitated on the knob. Tanya, she said, voice smaller now. Do you still want to see Ruby? That hurt more than I expected. Because of course I did. But I also knew I couldn't answer that question while standing on uneven ground. I want to be part of her life, I said, but not at the cost of losing myself. She swallowed, then, without another word, stepped out and closed the door behind her. I stood there for a long while, staring at the door. And then I turned back to my kitchen, poured myself tea, and sat down at the table, still whole, still here. No longer waiting, no longer pleading, and for the first time in years, not broken. I sat alone on the porch that evening, the last of the day's light brushing the tops of the trees. The wind was soft, gentle, carrying a faint scent of lilac from the neighbor's yard. Inside, the kettle clicked as it cooled, long after I'd poured myself a single cup of tea. I thought of Emily's visit, her posture, rigid with discomfort, the way her voice trembled at the end, not from sorrow, but from uncertainty, like she was unsure who I had become. But I hadn't become someone else. I had simply stopped being someone for everyone else. There's a difference. I remembered a phrase I used to say when Thomas was young, when he'd get into trouble at school or push the boundaries too far. I'm not mad. I just can't let this continue. It wasn't anger. It was responsibility. For both of us. Back then, it was over crayons on the wall or missed curfews. Now, it was something deeper, something more, invisible, yet far heavier. I took a slow sip of tea, letting it settle on my tongue before I spoke the words aloud, just to the wind. I'm not angry. I just won't allow this to go on. The moment the words left my lips, I felt something shift inside me, like a soft weight had been lifted, not thrown off in rebellion, but untied, quietly, with care. Because the truth was, I had waited, I had hoped, I had given them every opportunity to choose differently, but they hadn't, and I had to believe their choices spoke louder than their excuses. So now it was my turn to choose. I turned back into the house and picked up the small notebook from the kitchen drawer, the one with all the calls, the unanswered texts, the silences I had tried to turn into meaning. I flipped to the last page, and for the first time, instead of another log, I wrote something new. It's not rejection anymore. It's redirection. I paused, then underlined it once. I'd spent so long thinking love meant enduring, no matter how much it hurt. That being family meant always making space, even when the room was already collapsing around me. But maybe love also means self-respect. Maybe family also means not erasing yourself to fit someone else's convenience. Maybe it's okay to close the door softly when no one else remembers to knock. That night, I gathered a small box of things from the guest bedroom, a few toys I had kept for Ruby, a framed photo of her first birthday, her cake-smeared cheeks, and Thomas holding her proudly. I didn't throw them away. I simply placed them in a box, labeled it for later, not as a promise, not as punishment, but as an act of preservation, of memory, of boundaries. I wasn't erasing them. I was preserving myself. As I tucked the box into the hallway closet, I caught my reflection in the mirror, hair a little more silver than I remembered, lines a little deeper around my eyes, but there was something steady in my expression. Not grief, not bitterness, just knowing. I placed one hand gently on the mirror, not out of vanity, but out of acknowledgement. You didn't stop being a mother, I whispered to myself. You just stopped being invisible. It wasn't a declaration. It was a remembering. There's a kind of peace that comes not from fixing everything, but from finally seeing clearly and accepting that clarity costs more than sentiment. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need dramatic reconciliations. I needed alignment. And in that quiet night, surrounded by my own breath and stillness, I found it. I turned off the lights one by one and walked slowly to my bedroom, the house humming with quiet, not emptiness. Because finally, I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't bracing. I wasn't shrinking. I was just here, present, clear. And I knew, even if they never came back, I hadn't lost myself trying to make them stay. The knock on my door this time was lighter. Not urgent, not demanding. It was hesitant, like someone unsure if they were still welcome. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened it slowly. And there she stood. Ruby, 14 now. Taller than I remembered, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail, and freckles still dancing across her cheeks like they had when she was 5. She was holding something, a folded piece of paper, maybe a card. "Hi, Grandma," she said, her voice soft, cautious. I hadn't seen her in months, maybe more. My heart wanted to leap toward her to pull her into the warmth of my arms like I always used to. But I held still, not cold, but careful. I nodded and stepped aside. "Come in, honey." She hesitated for a moment before stepping over the threshold, like even she could feel that something sacred had been broken in this house, and she wasn't sure how to move in it anymore. She glanced around the living room. "It's the same." "Yes," I said gently. "It's always been your grandma's house." She sat at the edge of the couch, her hands tucked under her thighs the way she used to do when she was nervous before dance recitals. "I didn't know if I should come," she said, "but I wanted to." I sat across from her, not beside, just close enough. I made banana bread today, I said, voice even. Your favorite. Still remember? Her eyes lit up faintly. Of course. You used to let me mash the bananas. I smiled, a flicker of old warmth rising up between us. Then she said it. I miss you. 3 words, simple but heavy, carried on the back of months of silence, of holidays missed, of birthday cards unread. I didn't respond right away. I let the quiet speak for me, not to punish, but to let the weight of those words land properly. She reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out the folded paper. She passed it to me, head bowed slightly. Inside was a drawing, crayons, bold lines, a banana bread on a plate, and a little stick figure grandma next to it, smiling. Underneath, in uneven handwriting, were the words, I remember the person who made the cake more than the cake. I pressed my lips together. My throat tightened. She looked up, eyes glistening. Mom always said you were being dramatic, that you made things complicated, but I started thinking maybe that's not the full story. I let her speak, let her process. I saw the way she talks about you when you're not around, and I saw how you used to be the one who made everything feel safe, not perfect, but real. And I miss that. A tear slipped down her cheek. I'm sorry. For not calling. For not asking sooner. I moved closer then, just slightly. It's okay to be young and confused, Ruby, I said softly. It's okay to follow your parents, but it's also okay to ask your own questions. She nodded, wiping her eyes on her sleeve. I just didn't know what I was allowed to feel. That broke something in me. Gently. Like the snap of an old branch that had been holding too much for too long. Here, I whispered, opening my arms slowly. She didn't hesitate. She came forward and wrapped herself around me, like she used to when her knees were scraped, and she didn't want anyone else to see her cry. We stayed like that for a while. No phones buzzing, no voices explaining or defending, just heartbeat to heartbeat. She pulled back, eyes still wet. Can I come over more? I smiled. You never stopped being welcome. She smiled back, tentative but real. Can I help bake next time? I nodded, brushing a stray hair from her forehead. Of course, but you're not just the helper anymore. You're old enough now to be the one who remembers the ingredients. And the stories. She laughed through her tears. Even the one about me dropping the egg on your shoe? Especially that one, I said. We sat together for a while after that, sipping tea and eating warm banana bread. And for the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel quiet in a hollow way. It felt full of possibility, of repair. And I realized that sometimes healing doesn't knock down the door with apologies. Sometimes it just arrives, softly, carrying a folded drawing and the courage to say, I still remember the love. After we finished the banana bread, Ruby wandered to the old bookshelf, her fingers brushing the spines of books she used to pull out for bedtime stories. She paused at the photo album. That still here? She asked. I nodded. Some things don't get boxed away. She sat beside me on the couch, and I opened the album slowly. The pages crackled, but the colors still held. There we were, her just a toddler in overalls, cake on her cheeks, Thomas behind her, laughing, Emily holding her like something fragile and holy. Ruby leaned closer. I remember this, kind of. I turned another page, me holding her at the zoo, her eyes wide at a flamingo. That was the day she threw her whole sippy cup at the giraffe. I chuckled. Ruby laughed, quiet and honest. You remember everything. I looked at her. When you love someone, the memories tend to stay. She was quiet for a moment, fingers pausing on a picture of us three baking, flour on her nose, my apron tied around her like a dress. "I don't know what happens next," she said softly. "With Mom or Dad." I placed my hand over hers. "You don't need to know yet," I said. "Forgiveness. It doesn't have to come fast. Just don't close the door all the way." She nodded. Neither of us said much after that, but when she left, she hugged me again, this time tighter. And I knew the wound was still there, but so was the will to heal. A week later, I sat in Grace's office once again. The sky outside was soft with spring clouds, and the scent of fresh-cut grass drifted in through the cracked window. I watched it quietly as Grace laid the papers before me, her pen uncapped and ready. "I just want to be sure," she said gently. "Once this is signed, it's binding." "I'm sure," I replied. She nodded, then turned the page so it faced me. This wasn't done out of spite. It wasn't retaliation. It was simply clarity, finally placing what I'd built, what I'd saved, where I believed it would truly matter. Shelter Haven had been my refuge after Frank passed, a small women's center tucked at the edge of town, where they offered beds, counseling, and quiet dignity to those who had nothing left but themselves. That place had reminded me that healing was possible, that even the forgotten could be seen again. Now it would receive everything I had: the house, the savings, the retirement fund. I left a small portion aside for Ruby, just in case. But the rest? It would go toward shelter, toward safety, toward silent strength. I signed my name. And as the pen left the paper, I felt no regret, only resolve. Not every legacy is a family name carved into marble. Some are the quiet choices made behind closed doors, choices that say, "This is who I loved, and this is where I chose to plant hope." Most people didn't know, not even Thomas, especially not Thomas. Years ago, long before the nice neighborhood, the big kitchen, the polite Thanksgiving tables, I had nothing but a soaked cardigan and a baby pressed to my chest. Frank had left, just vanished one morning. No note, no goodbye, just a mortgage and silence. I walked for miles that night, holding Thomas tight under my coat as the rain soaked through to my bones. He was barely 1, still feverish, still clinging to my blouse with tiny fingers that didn't know what abandonment meant. I sat on a bus stop bench with no bus coming, just me and the sound of tires slicing through puddles. Then a woman, no older than I am now, pulled up in a rusty van. Her name was Elsie. She rolled down the window and said only one thing: "I know where you can sleep tonight." That place was Shelter Haven, a shared room with bunk beds, warm soup in a chipped bowl, a counselor who gave me clean clothes and said I didn't have to explain right away. That place held me when no one else would. It gave me a job filing envelopes. It gave me dignity when I had nothing else to trade. So, no, this wasn't a random gift. It was a circle, closing gently. Shelter Haven didn't save me with sermons or promises. It saved me with hot tea, with warm lights, with soft voices saying, "You are not broken, just in need of a safe place." And now, decades later, I finally became the safe place for someone else. The apartment wasn't large, or modern, or impressive in any particular way. But as soon as I stepped inside, I exhaled, fully. For the first time in what felt like years. The floors creaked faintly, and the paint on the window trim was slightly chipped. But the light poured in through east-facing glass like it had been waiting for me. It didn't have a yard, no flower beds, no long driveway, But it had something else. Peace. The agent gave me space to look around. I walked from the tiny kitchen to the small balcony, just enough room for a potted herb garden and a single chair. I imagined myself there, tea in hand, a book on my lap. No doorbell ringing without kindness behind it. It wouldn't fit all the furniture from the old house. And that was the point. I didn't need all of it. I didn't want the echoes of a home that had long since stopped being mine. Here, I could start small, start again, on my terms. A place where I wasn't needed, just welcome, where silence wasn't punishment, but permission. I turned back to the agent and said, "I'll take it." She smiled. "It's not fancy, but it's a good place." And I nodded. Fancy never kept me warm. As I signed the lease, I felt a strange, tender freedom settle in my chest. Not flashy, not dramatic, just solid. And as I looked around at bare walls and unfilled shelves, I whispered something only I needed to hear. This is enough. I am enough. Packing was quieter than I expected. No rush, no deadline pressed against my back. Just me, 3 boxes, and a marker. I labeled them plainly: keep, donate, past. The first box held what I truly needed: my tea set, the quilt my mother stitched when I was 21, a photo of Ruby at 3 with blueberry stains on her chin. The second filled up quickly: sweaters I hadn't worn in years, books I'd once loved, now ready for a new pair of hands, things that were useful, but no longer mine. Then came the hardest one: the past box, the marriage license. Frank's old flannel shirt, faded and too soft to throw away. A Father's Day card Thomas made in kindergarten. Stick figures and a heart drawn crooked. I didn't want to burn them. Didn't need to display them either. Some memories aren't meant to be framed, just acknowledged. I folded each piece with care, as if tucking in old ghosts for a final rest. At the bottom of the drawer, I found a recipe card: banana bread, written in Ruby's early handwriting. That went into keep, because not everything from the past was painful. Some of it still held light. I sealed the boxes one by one, sat back, and looked around. The house was emptier, but I wasn't. I had just enough. And for once, I was moving toward something, not away from it. In the stillness, I said aloud, not to anyone, really, just to the space: "This chapter's done. And I'm the one holding the pen now." I walked the house one last time, not to double check, not to second guess, but to say goodbye, not to people, to things, to memories sealed into corners and fabric and wood grain. I stepped into the kitchen first, ran my hand across the counter where Ruby used to sit on her little step stool, begging to lick the spoon. "Thank you," I whispered, tracing the faint knife mark where Frank once sliced bread too hard. "You fed us. You held Sunday mornings." In the hallway, I paused by the coat rack. Frank's old jacket was gone, long since donated, but the hook still leaned slightly right, bent from years of heavy winters. "Thank you for carrying what we couldn't." In the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, ran my fingers across the quilt. It wasn't sadness, exactly. More reverence, like acknowledging a friend who'd sat with me in grief and didn't ask questions. I walked to the mirror above the dresser, looked myself in the eyes. "You made it," I said quietly. "You didn't think you would, but you did." Then came the hardest room. The guest room, once Thomas's, still bore faint marks of boyhood, stickers on the inside of the closet, a dent where he'd kicked the wall once after losing a school debate. I stood there longest, not to mourn him, but to bless the version of me who once waited for his laughter outside this very door. I release you, I whispered to the space. Not him, me. Then I stepped out, turned off the light, and let the house go, with every room still intact, but no longer needed to define me. Before I closed the front door for the last time, I went back to the hallway. The little drawer under the stair ledge, the one that always stuck just slightly, still creaked the same way it did 20 years ago. I used to keep batteries in there, spare keys, Band-Aids when Ruby scraped her knees on the front path. I opened it one last time, slow and steady. Inside, nothing remained but a little dust and the faint smell of cedar. I pulled a folded paper from my coat pocket, written in blue ink, my handwriting a little shakier now, but still mine. I read it to myself one more time, then pressed a strip of tape along the top edge and stuck it inside the drawer where someone, someday, might find it. This house taught me everything: how to hold on, how to let go, how to be needed, and how to need myself. Thank you. That was it. No dramatic final speech, no flourish, just a note from someone who had lived, who had lost, who had learned. I closed the drawer gently, then turned toward the door. I didn't take one last look around. I didn't need to. The house would remember me, and I had already carried the best of it with me, not in boxes, not in papers, but in quiet strength, in the lessons tucked between years of loving too much and forgetting myself too long. I placed the keys on the counter, slipped out, and with the softest click, I closed the door. My new apartment smelled like lemon cleaner and unopened cardboard. I had just unpacked the kettle when I heard the soft knock, 3 taps, like a memory. I opened the door to find Ruby, cheeks flushed from the walk, her arms full. A small box of banana bread, wrapped in parchment, a thrifted mug with faded sunflowers, and a glossy magazine with the title in bold. "Which flower are you?" I raised an eyebrow, amused. She shrugged, smiling shyly. "It reminded me of something you'd keep on your coffee table." I let her in. She placed the things down carefully, like offerings. "This place is peaceful," she said, looking around the uncluttered space. "It's mine," I replied simply. "That's the peace." We sat on the floor, because I hadn't bought a couch yet, and shared slices of warm bread. No heavy talk, no apologies demanded, just butter, crumbs, and a gentle quiet. She opened the magazine, flipping pages until she found the quiz. "Let's take it," she said, nudging me. "For fun." I humored her. 5 questions later, she announced, "You're a lavender." "Why?" I asked. She read aloud from the page. "Lavender souls bring calm. They carry old wisdom, often underestimated, but deeply rooted. They bloom quietly, but the whole field remembers." Ruby looked at me, eyes soft, voice lower. "That sounds like you." I didn't answer right away, just looked at her, really looked. And in that moment, something settled. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something gentler, like a bud beginning to trust the sun again. I folded the magazine, placed it beside the mug, and said, "Then I guess it's finally time I started blooming for myself." Later that evening, after Ruby left with a quiet hug and a promise to call, I sat by the small window in my new living room. The apartment was still mostly bare, just a lamp, a cushion, and the fading light curling across the hardwood floor. I opened the magazine again. The flower quiz page was slightly wrinkled now, soft from our fingers. My eyes lingered on the lavender description, but then drifted to another flower in the corner of the spread. Lilac. I hadn't thought of that flower in years. When I was little, there was a lilac bush behind our school. It never bloomed in winter, barely in spring, but when it did, just for a week or two, it filled the whole back field with fragrance. No one noticed until they stepped into it. Then they never forgot. That was me, I realized. Not loud, not bold, but rooted. I closed the magazine, set it aside, and whispered to the quiet room, I am a lilac tree. I don't demand attention. I don't bloom every season. But when I do, I know exactly why and exactly where I belong. Outside, the city moved on. Cars passed, neighbors laughed behind walls, someone walked a dog on the sidewalk below, and I sat still, present, not waiting for anyone, not hoping to be invited. Just being, not invisible, not forgotten, just enough. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't angry. I wasn't aching. I was anchored. And I said aloud, firm but tender, I am a lilac tree, silent but strong when I need to be. The envelope came on a Thursday, plain white, my name written in Thomas's handwriting, still the same slant he had in high school. I turned it over in my hands for a long while before finally opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no card, no decorations, just his words. Mom, I don't know how to fix what I broke. I don't even know where to begin, but I want to try. I want to learn how to be better, how to see you, not as someone who gives, but as someone who matters. Not just to Ruby, to me too. I know you don't owe me a second chance, but I'd be grateful for the opportunity to earn it, not as your son, automatically entitled, but as a man who needs to relearn how to be human. Would you consider meeting for coffee? No expectations, just start again. Love, Thomas. I set the letter down. My hands were still, my chest steady. No tears. Not this time. Because I'd already wept all I needed to. I'd grieved the version of him I once clung to. This letter wasn't a fix. It wasn't magic. But it was something. Not a demand. Not a guilt trip. An invitation. To witness him. Not excuse him. And in its simplicity, it carried more weight than all the gifts and gestures before. I looked at the return address on the envelope. 2 blocks from Ruby's school. Then I folded the letter and placed it between the pages of the lavender article. No decision made. Not yet. But the door wasn't locked anymore. I didn't write back. Not the next day. Not the next week. I didn't sit at my desk with a pen trembling in hand. Didn't pace the apartment waiting for words to form. Instead, I made tea. I swept the floor. I watered the small basil plant on the balcony. The one Ruby insisted I name, so I called it Hope, half-jokingly. And I thought about what healing really meant. Not for him. For me. Thomas's letter sat folded neatly inside the magazine, tucked between lavender and lilac, between who I was and who I was becoming. Some days I reached for it, read a line or two, then put it back. Not to dwell, just to remember that it happened, that maybe something had shifted. But still, I didn't respond, because I didn't owe him my immediacy or my forgiveness. I owed myself the space to decide, without pressure, without performance. And when people asked, "Did you ever talk to your son again?" I simply smiled and said, "He reached out. I heard him. That's enough for now." One night, I took the letter, slipped it into a small wooden box, the same one where I'd once kept Ruby's first drawing and Frank's watch. Then I closed the lid, not to hide it, but to place it, somewhere safe, somewhere sacred. Because not everything needs an answer to have meaning. Not every wound needs closure to begin healing. And as I whispered to the quiet again, I haven't forgiven, but I didn't tear it up. That is where I'll start. It was a breezy Sunday afternoon when Ruby visited again. She brought lemon muffins this time, still warm in a paper bag, and a secondhand scarf she thought would go nice with my new lavender energy. We sat on the park bench near my building, the one with the view of the quiet fountain. She swung her legs gently, the way she used to when she was 8. She looked older now, but in that light, I saw the child again, wide-eyed, heart forward. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a folded note, then hesitated. "Actually," she said, tucking it back, "I wanted to ask something instead." I waited. "Are you still mad?" Her voice wasn't scared, just soft, curious. I looked at her, really looked. Her eyes held no defense, only care. I took a slow breath, then replied, calm and clear. "No, sweet girl, I'm done being sad, and I've decided not to carry mad with me either. I'm not angry, I'm just done." She blinked. "Done with what?" I smiled. Not bitter, not heavy, just true. Done with waiting to be seen, done with chasing rooms I was never welcome in, done with measuring my worth by how others hold me. I've cried, I've questioned, I've hoped. But now I choose peace over proof. She didn't say anything for a while. Then, with a small nod, she leaned her head on my shoulder. We sat that way until the light turned gold, not needing to fill silence, just letting the breeze carry what we didn't need anymore. And in that stillness, I knew. Letting go didn't mean losing. It meant living without dragging the past behind me. And I was finally light enough to walk on. The next Saturday, Ruby brought over a book she thought we could read together. It was a simple story about women who found their voice late in life. No magic, no grand twists, just truth, gentle and unadorned. We sat by the window, each with a cup of tea. The late afternoon sun stretched across the table, spilling warm light onto our pages. At one point, Ruby paused and said, "There's a quote I underlined. Want me to read it?" I nodded. She flipped the page, cleared her throat, and read, "If they won't give you a seat at the table, build your own." I let that sink in. For a long moment, we didn't say a word. Just listened to the sound of the city in the distance, life moving forward. Then I said, quietly, "That's what I'm doing now." Ruby tilted her head. "What do you mean?" I closed the book softly and looked at her. All those years, I waited to be invited, to be asked, to be wanted. And I thought if I just gave more, softened more, stayed quiet longer, they'd make space. But now, I realize it was never about the table. It was about the voice. I sipped my tea, calm. So I'm building my own table now. It may be small, it may wobble a little, but it's mine. And the people who sit here, they'll know how to pass kindness as freely as the bread. Ruby reached across, gently touched my hand. No apology, no fixing, just presence. And as the sun lowered outside, I felt something settle. Not an ending, but the beginning of something earned, not begged, for a seat made not from permission, but from quiet strength. That morning, I walked to the post office with a cashier's check tucked carefully in an envelope. The amount wasn't enormous, not to most, but to me, it was dignity, wrapped in stillness, sealed with intention. On the front, I wrote, "Shelter Haven, Women's Transitional Center," and just below it, in the memo line, "For the woman with no shoes." Because I remembered her. The night I first arrived at that shelter, 32, soaked from the rain, holding Thomas as a baby, there was another woman curled on a cot in the far corner. No name, no bags, just a towel and a pair of socks that didn't match. She never spoke, But she looked at me once, with eyes that knew. I never forgot her. And I never forgot how it felt to have nothing but a child. And a question. Now what? Shelter Haven didn't give me riches. They gave me stillness, a safe place to breathe between endings and what might come next. I sealed the envelope, pressed it flat, and slid it into the outgoing box. Then stood there for a while, watching the small red flag rise. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a statement. It was a full circle. For the woman with no shoes. For the one I was. For the ones who still are. For the ones who'll need someone to believe in them. Quietly, gently, before they can believe in themselves. I walked home slower than usual. Not tired, just full. And as I passed a flower stand, I paused to buy a single lilac stem. It wasn't in season, but somehow they had one, and that felt enough. I placed the lilac stem in an old glass jar, the kind I used to use for leftover jam, and set it by the window where the light reached longest. The apartment was quiet, but not empty. Somehow, every corner now held something soft. Ruby's laughter, Grace's steadiness, a flicker of the woman I'd finally become. I sat with my tea, wrapped in the scarf Ruby gave me, and watched the city carry on outside. It had been months since that backyard, since I heard the words that once bruised me so deeply. Why is she even still alive? They hadn't known I was standing there, and maybe they didn't mean it to land the way it did, but it did. And for a while, I asked myself that same question. Why am I still here? Not invited, not remembered, not needed. But today, I think I understand. I'm still alive to witness the softness that comes after the storm, to build my own table, to write my name again, not as someone's mother or wife or mistake, but as me, Teresa Holloway, the woman who once stood barefoot at a shelter door, the woman who poured tea instead of poison, the woman who didn't yell, didn't break, but stood, bloomed when no one watched. And as I wrote a final note for myself, tucked into the back of the Lavender magazine, I said it aloud for no one and for everyone. They asked why. I'm still alive. Now I know to remember my name. And this time I didn't whisper it. I said it like it mattered. Because it does.